Every year during the month before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, I try to learn something new. Some years, I have to admit, it's more aspirational than real, but this year I took an online course in the book of Deuteronomy with Micah Goodman, who is one of the leading Jewish thinkers today. And I want to share just a couple of insights that I learned from him. Deuteronomy is especially relevant to us today for a number of reasons. First of all, we will finish the reading of Deuteronomy and the entire Torah tomorrow morning on Simchat Torah. And second, the traditional Haftarah, not the one you heard today, but the traditional Haftarah for Shmini Atzeret, is the prayer of Solomon, which was offered at the dedication of the temple in Jerusalem, which took place today on Shmini Atzeret. And Deuteronomy has a lot to say about the temple and the kings during the first temple period. It was written long after the temple was built, and so it contains some important lessons about the experience of our people with kings. And also, as we reach the conclusion of the festival period, it's important that we be sure to avoid any distortion of religion. And Micah Goodman points out that power misused can lead to this distortion of religion. Power misused can cause religion to be made into magic. And he also notes that power misused can distort politics because it can lead to tyranny. Now, how does power do that? Well, we're all anxious about the future. We don't know what the future holds. But someone comes along and tells us a story that says, you can control your future. You perform a ritual and it rains. You perform another ritual, you win a war. And that kind of thinking can be very seductive because then you don't have to feel so anxious anymore. Rabbi Harold Kushner, in one of his books, tells a story about how he was supposed to perform a wedding in the backyard of one of his congregants, and it was looking like rain, and the mother of the bride is so worried that the rain is going to spoil the plan. And so what does she do? She takes a $20 bill and she puts it into the charity box. Half an hour later, it's still overcast, looks threatening. She puts another $20 bill into the pushki. And a few minutes later, the sun comes out. Her mom does, the mom does the little victory dance. Oh yeah, right? We can all agree that tzedakah is good and still regard this as a misuse, as a flawed use of religion. And by the way, the other way some people deal with this kind of anxiety is to have someone else control everything. Natalie, Joshua, how would you like for that to happen? Mom and Dad get to make all the decisions about your future, what your job will be, and who you will marry. How's that going to work out? You're not so good, right? I'm sure it's not really going to happen that way, right? Good thing, right? But some people apply this to rabbis too. Rabbi, you should pray that the weather will change. Even when people say this as a joke, it's only partly a joke, right? So I want to assure all of you that at Beth Yeshurun, only the senior rabbi has the power to change the weather, right? And, just for a little while, we hope that someone else will take care of things as if we were little kids again. So it's a big concern how easily politics turns into tyranny and how easily religion turns into magic. And this is a helpful way of understanding what's revolutionary about the book of Deuteronomy. It's about creating a religion that is not about magical control, a religion where God is beyond nature and you cannot capture God. You have hints of this elsewhere in the Torah. When Moses asks God his name, God says, yeah, Asher, yeah, I will be what I will be. You can't control me with a name. So there. God is at Sinai, but the people cannot see God there. The book of Deuteronomy comes down hard on this theme in two ways. It brings about two revolutions, one for religion and one for politics. Number one, taking God out of the temple is a new kind of religion. And number two, taking absolute power away from the king is a new politics. Those are the revolutions of Deuteronomy. The Torah is asking us to imagine something. That yes, God brings the Israelites out of Egypt, but the vision of Deuteronomy, that's for when they come into the land of Israel. They will build a temple, but God doesn't live there. The temple is a place to access a feeling of closeness to God, but God doesn't actually live there. People can perform rituals there, but the rituals don't give you an illusion of being in control. And yes, there is a king, but the king has limited power. It's a new kind of religion, new kind of politics. In both of these, the people have to step up and take more responsibility, not just depend on God or the king. That is how the Torah ends. And even though this vision was not implemented, or at least not well, in the time of the first temple, doesn't mean it can't be. The prophet Jeremiah is also a big believer in this approach. That, God doesn't live in the temple, but, he says in chapter 7 of his book, if you behave yourselves, if you fix your actions, you can keep the temple. You will get to dwell here. God doesn't live at the temple any more than God lives at Beth Yeshurun. The Bible says there were false prophets who said that God lives in the temple, and therefore you are all protected. The Bible calls them false prophets. Today we would call it fake news. Jeremiah says, don't listen to the propaganda about the temple, the fake news. You must protect the people who are not protected. It's not about rituals, it's about social sensitivity. Only if you have justice between people, if you don't take advantage of the immigrant, the orphan, and the widow, all these people who are not protected, if you don't shed innocent blood or follow false gods, then only will I let you remain in this place. Jeremiah says the temple will be destroyed and you will be exiled, not because you didn't take the temple seriously, but because you took it too seriously. There's no magic about the temple. Good behavior usually brings about good results. Didn't work out that way for Jeremiah himself, of course, but every rule has an exception. Unfortunately, the people had a very hard time with this message. They were trapped in the myth that the temple magically protected them, that God lived in the temple. And that myth corrupted them. They didn't realize you could have rituals which could be meaningful, but are not magical. There's nothing magic involved with saying a particular prayer in a particular way. I don't keep Shabbat because I think that it will protect me or my family. I don't keep kosher because I'm afraid something bad will happen if I don't. I keep them because I believe God wants Jews to maintain a Jewish way, and that this way adds meaning to our lives. It's a more difficult sell than magic, to be sure, but it's a lot more honest. And if we look at the traditional Haftarah for Shmini Atzeret, the beautiful prayer of King Solomon, given at the final day of the dedication of the temple in Jerusalem, how does it fit into this picture? Solomon certainly prays that the people will never fail to keep the rules of the Torah, that his subjects should always walk in God's ways. But then, what does he do? He offers as sacrifices 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep. That's quite a stockyards there. Imagine how much we at Beth Yeshurun would have to enlarge our campus to fit all those animals. Think of the kind of taxes people had to pay to enable King Solomon to offer those sacrifices. not to mention all those who had to be hired to clean up after all those animals. But this was Solomon's grand style. Solomon, who taxed the people in order to raise the money to build the magnificent temple. Solomon, who virtually enslaved people to work on the building of the temple. Solomon, who took on many wives and built lavish houses for them to make alliances with the surrounding nations. And the people put up with all this oppression, this overbuilding, overtaxation, because after all, this was Solomon, the son of David. Solomon, the wise and gifted king. But what happens after Solomon dies? When his son says, I'm going to keep up this grand style, I'm going to tax the people even more, he finds that what his father could get away with, he can't. The northern tribes break off from those who remain loyal to him. Paradoxically, the king loses power by not being willing to give up some power. The people would no longer live with that kind of tyranny. And of course, both northern and southern tribes are weakened. Eventually, both of them are conquered. It's one of the great tragedies of Jewish history brought about by our own weaknesses. Deuteronomy, written with some knowledge of this history, seeks to place limits on the power of kings. The kings must not do what Solomon did, to multiply possessions and take many wives. The king must show that he, more than the rest of the people, is bound by the laws of the Torah, by keeping a scroll of the Torah with him at all times. In a way, it was a compromise with human nature. They wanted order, but they needed to avoid tyranny. So kings, but with limited power. The temple was there, but must not also have much power. It's not magical. Don't try to bring in 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep, because as the prophets all tell us, God is not impressed by that kind of excess. You can't control God no matter how many rituals you perform. The message of the prophets was that people were not working on the vision of Moses, the vision of this book we will finish reading tomorrow. It's ironic and tragic that the people of the Bible didn't live up to the vision of the Bible. Too often the people and the kings forget this vision, and sometimes we do too. The good news is that we have second chances. Joshua, Natalie, I know it wasn't in the original plan for your B'nai Mitzvah, but you wound up having them today on Shmini Atzeret. Shmini Atzeret itself is one of those second chances. Because maybe someone just didn't make the connection with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the connection with God, with Torah, with Jewish life. Or maybe someone thought that just by praying on those days, they would be okay in the year ahead. There's that magical thinking creeping back in. The rabbis tell us the real idea behind Shmini Atzeret. They tell a parable of a king who arranged a multi-day feast for all his children and their families, maybe at one of those resorts in the hill country, right? And they spend a number of happy days together, and the guests start packing up, and the king says, please, don't go. Stay one more day with me. It's hard for me to say goodbye to you. And similarly, after the observances and celebrations of the high holidays, after days of sitting in the sukkah, the Torah says, wait, don't run away so quickly. Hold back one more day. Spend another day with your Creator. Spend another day to connect. And it's all up to us. It doesn't magically happen. It's only when we make the time for God, when we make the time for religion, when we make the time for our sacred traditions, when we make all of those things part of our lives, they can connect us in ways that make our lives deeper, that are so powerful, they may even feel magical. The magical approach to Judaism will usually disappoint you in the end. But if you make Judaism part of your adult lives, Natalie, Joshua. If you make it part of your lives, I think you'll find it rewarding and enriching, and that it will help you be the people that you need to be. Most of the Jews of the Bible ultimately did not get there, but we can. We have another chance, and I hope that you will. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach.